The psychology of war cannot fully be understood without the acknowledgement of war's most important development, the development of guns. Barbara Ehrenreich discusses guns' effect on the view toward warfare in Chapter 11 of her book, Blood Rites. Ehrenreich is a social critic, not a military historian, so her analysis in this chapter is much more geared toward the social and psychological elements of war. Warfare used to be fought merely for honor. Samurai and knights were far more concerned with the rules and customs of the fight rather than its result. They would spend their whole lives training to be the noblest and most effective warriors possible. Guns completely altered this training regime. Instead of warriors coming from those who came from generational lineages whose entire identities have been devoted to the art of fighting, anyone could now be a fighter. If you could operate a gun, you could fight. No family legacy or lifetime of training required. Without the focus on family legacy, people began to think of war less in terms of fighting for honor, but instead fighting to win. Effective strategies became very important. Fighting with guns was not effective on smaller scales, so larger armies had to be developed. This led to the creation of a more centralized nation-state capable of levying taxes and assembling a large army. An issue with large armies was that historically, people from the lower classes were not used to working in large groups. This led to high rates of desertion. In order to keep armies together, a discipline regime needed to be developed. Through the institution of drills and uniforms, members of an army began to feel more like a group. Belonging to the army became an important part of a person's identity. Initially, the identity of the army was largely tied to the monarch for which the army fought. Over time, this changed. The American and French revolutions were not only fought absent a king's backing, but were both actively opposed to a king. Instead, these revolutions were fought to further ideals. These ideals were the ideals of a nation. Attachment to the identity of a nation became so great that people began to become willing to sacrifice their lives for their country. This introduced the concept of democratized glory, the idea that even the lowest soldiers could be recognized for their efforts to their country. Historically, only the top generals and warriors were awarded with medals and the thanks of their king, but after the French and American revolutions, this began to change. Average troops began to receive medals for their own gallantry in service of their nation. Even higher esteem was given to those who died fighting for the nation.
The emergence of the nation-state served as a shift that played a crucial role in bolstering nationalism. Nationalism itself is fervent devotion and loyalty to one's nation. Therefore, it's a phenomenon that allows for the emotional, social, and political mobilization of the general public in times of war. At its core, nationalism is about harnessing emotions. This often comes in handy when states use the profound sense of pride and unity to prepare the public for war. Nationalism plays a vital role in most, if not all, modern wars, but it was especially important during World War II. During World War II, nationalism had to have been sustained by emotional mobilization of participant populations, which included not only soldiers in combat but also civilians. Since the war reached every aspect of society, civilians faced nearly the same chances of death as soldiers. Essentially, because everyone was involved in the war in some capacity, they had an emotional investment in the war. Throughout World War II, the phenomenon of nationalism was present on both sides of the spectrum, the Axis powers and the Allied powers. Two examples from these two opposing sides of the war are Nazi Germany and the United States, both of which were successful at using nationalism to validate personal sacrifices and rally group unity for the war. Let's first take a look at Nazi Germany, which, according to Barbara Ehrenreich, is the closest thing to a freestanding religion of nationalism. Under the Nazi regime, nationalism was structured almost like a religion, where the Führer, or Adolf Hitler, served as the prophet. It is interesting to note that Hitler himself claimed, "We are not a movement, rather we are a religion." Another aspect of German nationalism that helped mobilize the war effort was the need for vindication following World War I. Hitler was able to rile up the German public by emotionally appealing to a group of people that had not only lost a war, but were made a mockery of with the Treaty of Versailles. Adolf Hitler was able to use this in order to exploit the German people. Ultimately, Hitler used a sense of national pride to unify the German people, informing them that they were the superior Aryan race, in order to successfully turn them against their fellow citizens, particularly targeting Jewish people. Across the Atlantic, the United States employed a similar strategy during the war. However, the nationalism of the United States looked slightly different from that of Nazi Germany. Because the US is a country made up of a heterogeneous group of people, the state united its people with patriotism. Americans who love their country and profess a willingness to die for it are not labeled as nationalists, but rather as patriots. The United States government, through various mediums, bombarded its citizens with patriotic imagery. Symbols such as the American flag and Uncle Sam became rallying points for unity. The message was clear. Every citizen had a civic duty to contribute to the war effort. To understand why nationalism had such a significant effect on the public's willingness to support the war, it's vital to understand the psychology of nationalism. The basis for group and national attachments are widely assumed to be a fundamental human need. At the level of the nation, the group fulfills economic, sociocultural, and political needs. It's also important to consider that nationalism is a form of group or cooperative behavior, which from an evolutionary psychology perspective promotes survival. Essentially, nationalism is rooted in psychology because humans are inclined to associate themselves with people they identify with and relate to.
Steven Pinker is a Canadian cognitive psychologist and professor in the Department of Psychology at Harvard. His research in language, emotion, the moral sense, rationality, and trends in violence display the reasoning behind human violence and his belief of torture decreasing since the Middle Ages. The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Decreased, was written by Pinker in 2011 and focuses on many aspects of violence, including psychology and human nature. Pinker claims that humans are not innately good, but they come equipped with motives that can orient them away from violence and towards cooperation, including empathy, self-control, moral sense, and reason. Neuroscientists have known that aggression in animals is not a unitary phenomenon. With 8 billion people in the world, there's no predicting what can happen in the hands of evil. Neuroscientists at Virginia Commonwealth University claim positive emotions actually also play a pretty big role in aggressive behavior as well. So aggression can feel good, and that pleasure is a really potent motivating force. So aggression isn't just about, I'm angry and I want to hit someone. It's also about how it feels good sometimes to get revenge on someone who has wronged you or who you perceive as having wronged you. Violence over the centuries has been like a turbulent storm in the vast ocean of human interaction. Imagine the storm as a massive, relentless hurricane swirling with anger and conflict. But as time has passed, a calm breeze of change has begun to blow, gradually dispersing the dark clouds of violence. In the Middle Ages, honor was of the most importance to many men. To maintain the credibility of their deterrent threat, knights engaged in bloody tournaments and other demonstrations, gussied up with words like honor, valor, chivalry, glory, and gallantry. Although one achieved high status through the use of force, the European decline of violence was spearheaded by a decline in elite violence. Across time, the more preachable societies also tend to be richer, healthier, better educated, better governed, more respectful of their women, and more likely to engage in trade. Halfway decent governments also provide basic services like education, which gives young men an alternative to adventure in militias and an infrastructure of commerce. The factor of education and development of books altered the views of violence and humanity. An increase in productivity because of Gutenberg and paper making grew faster than the growth of the entire British economy during the Industrial Revolution. Not only were more people reading, but they were reading in different ways, more secular than just religious. The most remarkable anti-war document of the era was Kant's 1795 essay, Perpetual Peace. Violence pervaded their entertainment as well in the Middle Ages. Pinker described popular sports at the time, including violence on pigs and cats, as well as humans. A major shift occurred when people began to sympathize with more of their fellow humans and were no longer indifferent to their suffering. A new ideology became one that placed life and happiness at the center of values, as well as scientific evidence as reason for torture, rather than religious belief, as seen in the witch trials. Although violence has a positive feeling to some, Pinker claims people became more compassionate as their own lives improve. Post-war era, symbolically inaugurated by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, has seen a growing revulsion against aggression on smaller scales, including violence against minorities, women, children, and animals. Today, the most crime-prone regions in the world have corrupt police forces and judicial systems. Compared to the Middle Ages, men are more discourteous than savages because they know they can be impolite without having their skulls split.
The statistical impacts of war throughout history reveal changes in human interaction and how war presents itself throughout society. From a historical perspective, World War I and World War II did not occur very long ago. The World Wars are widely taught and discussed, and their documentation through photographs, recordings, and actual death tolls have led individuals to believe that the 20th century has been the bloodiest time in history. Yet, there is more to consider. Pinker explains that when population sizes are skewed to match the population size of the 20th century, other historical periods prevail as far more violent. For example, with a skewed population, the An-Lushan revolt in the 8th century would have resulted in 429 million deaths. The Atlantic slave trade from the 15th to the 19th century would have accounted for 83 million deaths, and the fall of the Ming dynasty in the 17th century would have resulted in 120 million deaths. The amount of violence during periods in history from the perspective of population also connects to Pinker's explanation of the long peace. There have been 0 nuclear wars, 0 conflicts between 2 great powers since 1953, and 0 states that have gone extinct through conquest. The point of all the zeros is to highlight that the long peace has been impacted by changes in the mainstream developed world. In the past, public opinion supported the legitimacy of war. In modern times, these mindsets have changed as humans have grown more in favor of peace. These conclusions reached by Pinker about the potential of a long peace may be challenged by recent spikes in violence. The 2023 Global Peace Index has revealed concerning information regarding a surge in global conflicts. There has been a 25% increase in the number of battle-related deaths from 2021 to 2022, specifically in Asian Pacific and Sub-Saharan African territories. And with increased violence in areas such as Ukraine, Ethiopia, Myanmar, and Mali, 2022 produced the highest number of deaths from armed conflicts since 1994. Internationalized conflicts, meaning conflicts between 2 internal forces that receive outside international support, has increased to 9 times the rate from 2004 to 2017. With conflicts between Palestine and Israel resulting in thousands of deaths and international forces on both sides of the conflict, there is potential for more significant conflict between powers to break out. The reality of this increase in violence does not necessarily change Pinker's points. Instead, it supports them. Pinker speaks extensively on the randomness involved when creating statistical probabilities of war. War's likelihood goes down daily when conflict does not present itself. Therefore, the highest possibility of conflict is always the day following a time without violence. Even when violent events occur in clusters, outside factors contribute to the probability of those events happening. There is constant presence of the possibility of war, yet within that constant probability there is also constant randomness. Predicting when violence will increase is difficult. Studying the statistical data from war reveals the catastrophic possibilities of war, while in the same appreciation of history and statistics also supports the extreme unlikeliness of these catastrophes happening.